we open our session this morning, focusing on violence, I want to spend a few minutes offering a rudimentary framework for our discussion and sketching out some categories within which the term violence might be explored today. As I see it, there are at least three distinct but interlocking lines of inquiry that we might pursue in our considerations this morning. And if I could have my PowerPoint. The first kind of violence, which most immediately springs to mind when we use the word, is the violence of personal injury, of directly and conspicuously damaging another. In this category, we'd certainly include all events that physically injure a person, or a creature, or a place. And we'd also want to include psychological and emotional injury, as might result from verbal abuse, deprivation, witnessing a traumatic event, and so on. And we might also include here environmental violence, whether of the kind in which an environment does violence to people, as with hurricanes and tsunamis, or in which people do violence to their environment through pollution, strip mining, clear cutting, etc. In short, our discussions today will certainly address the representation of events in which someone or something is directly and manifestly violated. This category of violence has, of course, played prominently in the contemporary arts across a spectrum of lived human experience, from depictions of explicit physical gore to artifacts of traumatic experience. This is a video work by Gillian Wearing in which she put out a newspaper ad asking for people to talk about their traumatic experiences on video. Their identities will be concealed. And people responded to this newspaper ad, this want ad, and they were given child masks, adolescent masks, and then recounting these traumas. This work is called Trauma. Teresa Margolis has extracted walls from various places in Mexico, Juarez, where people were executed in front of these walls. She extracts them and replaces them in a gallery. Whether handled flippantly or melodramatically, or with great empathy, this kind of violence tends to be visceral and challenging. It challenges our sense of propriety and social solidarity. It challenges our notions of human dignity and personhood. Whatever response it evokes in us, from thrill to revulsion, the conspicuous violation of a person is always begging questions of what it means to be human and what it means to flourish as a human person or human community. The second category of violence, which might be explored today, is a bit more elusive, so it's worth articulating. And it's arguably the dominant sense in which violence has functioned in the contemporary academic art discourse. This is the violence of social and institutional power. Whereas the first category designates discrete events of injury, this category is preoccupied with systemic violence. Here we encounter the notion that the ordering and arranging of social life through language, custom, economics, institutions, and so on, might systemically exclude, coerce, subjugate, and/or violate particular people or groups of people. It's important to note that this kind of violence is often unintentionally and inconspicuously violent. It occurs in the operation of culture and often on its margins, not necessarily in consciously malicious acts. This is the kind of violence primarily in view in many forms of cultural criticism, in which social norms, histories, and institutions are scrutinized for their abusive effects, even if they're unintentional abusive effects. Foucault argued that conspicuous forms of violence or coercion, which generally define our first category of violence, are, relative to the second category, weaker forms of power. A much stronger power is that which attracts imitation and operates in our desires and our consent, and at the level of our presuppositions, what we regard to be possible or impossible, appropriate or inappropriate, desirable or undesirable. And for this reason, artists working in this vein tend to not portray conspicuous harm. Rather, when this category of violence is explored in the arts, it often appears with seductive surfaces, and places viewers' desires in conflict. It asks questions about what kinds of violence are involved, albeit often invisibly and unintentionally, in the production of the food we'll eat today, the clothes we're wearing, the fuel that brought us here, the speech we'll use today, as well as the institutions that support and make possible the artworks that we'll look at. This is an example from Fred Wilson called Mining the Museum, in which his artwork was to recurate a museum. Here, recurating the metalwork exhibition to include many more metalworks than you might expect in an art exhibition. Thus critiquing not only some of the implicit violence behind that metalwork, what we would expect to find, but maybe also implicit violence in the ways that we curate exhibitions, excluding some things, including some things. There might be unintentional violence, even by way of silence. The third sense in which violence will likely enter into our discussion today comes from the branch of philosophy called ontology, which focuses on questions of being. In this category, we might ask whether, or the extent to which, existence itself is violent at its most basic level, or simply is in itself a kind of violence, an event of violence. We might refer to examples in this third category as presenting ontologies of violence. So if you hear that term, this is what it's referring to. Ancient mythologies, from the Mesopotamians to the Romans and beyond, consistently explain the fact of being, that there is something rather than nothing, as the result of some primordial violence, the vicious tearing of an original unity into multiple beings. In this light, we might glimpse the significance of the opening chapter of Genesis, not in its compatibility or incompatibility with modern science, which wasn't in its view at all, but rather in its contention that the world came to be through peaceful means and was made for peaceful ends. That's the revolutionary significance of Genesis in many ways. Of the three, this category is certainly the most abstract and difficult to discuss, but it is also perhaps the most basic. Put in its simplest terms, the question here is whether we believe that being itself at its most primordial level is a violent event. Does the violence go all the way down, so to speak? Is the appalling violence that we witness in our world an intrusion into a world created for shalom, or is it, in fact, the most basic ontological reality, against which our efforts at peacefulness are perhaps valiant attempts to constrain and manage? This is a work by Charlie Ray called Unpainted Sculpture, in which he took a car involved in a fatal accident and took it apart piece by piece, cast it, and then reassembled it in this kind of gray, ghostly color. It's a haunting piece. The reason I include it as an example of perhaps touching on ontology of violence is that on the back bumper, there happens to be this little kind of insignia, those raised bumper insignias. Jesus is Lord. I think the question behind this work is he Lord? And if so, how does this kind of violence unfold? Does this work suggest a kind of unraveling of the whole idea? Is this a kind of emblem of violence, the violence implicit in existence itself? And certainly, all of Damien Hirst's work are devoted to the idea that being is fundamentally violent. I think that's my reading anyway.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.